Dear Daniela, every year in New Zealand around May, the darkness starts to take over. The rain becomes more frequent, and the droves of tourists that take advantage of the 15 hours of summer sunlight and warmth return to their homes far away. The country begins to shut down, with many shops, tours, and even entire towns closing for the winter season. But I'm not one to let the rain stop me. In fact, I'd argue it's this time of year that New Zealand is the most fun for adventures. And what better way to do that than one of my favorite things in the world, trains.
Welcome to the Northern Explorer. I'm hoping you guys can hear me, but it's very loud out here.
Rather than busting your earballs with bad audio, let me tell you a little bit about the Northern Explorer, New Zealand's longest running passenger service, which travels between Auckland and Wellington. The railway took over 2 decades to build, and it first ran on the 7th of August in 1908, taking over 20.5 hours and requiring several locomotive changes to travel the 648 kilometers. At one point, the service ran overnight, but in 2004, this was withdrawn, citing poor patronage and making it the last overnight service in all of New Zealand.
Today's the day. I'm super stoked to get on a train. Like, genuinely, there's basically nothing I love more than trains.
The train runs 3 times weekly from Auckland to Wellington and 3 times returning. Rather than taking the train both ways though, I opted for a short 1-hour flight to Wellington and just a one-way trip back to Auckland. Being that the Wellington train station is very central, an early Saturday flight for just 94 New Zealand dollars allowed me a day to explore before the 11-hour train ride on Sunday.
Stop the train in an emergency. You can operate an emergency stop.
Trains are the best.
Locate beverages to purchase and are only allowed. Fire extinguishers are located.
So, with 2 other much more scenic train trips in New Zealand, why have I chosen the Northern Explorer? And would I recommend it? Well, those are very good questions that you're asking here. But first, let me show you around.
So it looks like there's 2 main passenger cars for people who are just traveling regular core class. I don't want to disturb everyone, but I will show you an image of going what it looks like inside. It's super spacious, a lot of foot space, so it's cool. So there's a super comfortable dining car where you can get full services. There's wine, there's beer, there's food, there's snacks, there's ice cream. So yeah, a lot of availability. Not a lot of seating in here though, surprisingly, but yeah, really big windows. You can see a beautiful view while sitting here. Excuse me, sorry. Alright, so I've just hit the end of the train. This is where they store all the baggage, so that means that there are 2 main passenger cars. There's also the cafe, and there's the open carriage you would have already seen. The train is not super crowded. I would say most of the seats are empty, which is probably because it's winter. I would say it's still worth it because during the winter they run a bunch of deals. I actually got this journey 30% off being a local and also in the middle of winter. So there are some advantages to the winter. Don't let the weather deter you.
Now, to be fair, 30% off was certainly a motivating factor, but you don't hop on an 11-hour train in the middle of winter rain because of a discount. No. Those of us who take advantage of the winter downturn have other motivations, normally starting with a deep love of trains that dates back to our childhoods. So right now we are stopped in Palmerston North, which is one of the few stops that the train makes along the way, and I thought it would be a really good time to tell you guys about where my love of trains comes from. So when I was a really young kid, every single year I would go to Pennsylvania, USA and stay at my Uncle George's farmhouse, and in order to get to his farm you had to cross over a train track, and I remember you would hear the train a couple miles off and I would run and I would grab all my pennies and I would run up to the train with all my siblings, and then I would take the pennies and I would put them on the train track and have them get squished. And I actually have a few of them still to this day. And after the train would leave, I would put my ear to the train track and I would listen to the vibrations of the train. And this really was where my love of trains began. Love trains so much. My Uncle George's farmhouse was one of the few safe places of my childhood. And as it turns out, if we have positive experiences attached to certain activities, we create an emotional attachment to them. So even though it was the dead of winter, gray, wet, everything was closed, and the towns were slightly derelict, My emotional attachment to trains left me giddy and able to see the beauty that others might ignore.
So apparently we're about ready to pass the Rangitikei Gorge, which is featured in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If you haven't seen it, it's one of those things you have to do when you first come to New Zealand, is watch all 3 of them. I did within the first month of living here. And apparently the last of the 4 viaducts is one of the original ones that was built. So let's go have a look. It's hot outside.
I fell into the rhythm of the train, listening to the history, watching the world pass by. There was this sort of cadence to the train which lulled you into a peaceful state while scenery flew by. It reminded me of my childhood, leaning over the open car rails, looking down at deep gorges. When the cadence of the train changed, it signaled that new scenery was to come.
So we're coming up on Okahune, which sits at the foothills of Mount Ruapehu. It's really sad. Apparently Mount Ruapehu erupts every 50 years or so, and one year it erupted, and the lahe, which is like the sediment that ran down the river as like basically lava, dirt, everything like that, it came and knocked down the supports of the bridge that goes over a river. And the train didn't get enough warning and actually went over the bridge and crashed and killed everyone on board. So, super sad story. If you want to learn more about the accident, there's a documentary that was made, and I'll link it below in the description.
For most people, it would be disappointing to hear interesting facts about an area and be unable to see the subject in question. The winter clouds covered the entire volcano. But the benefit of the winter gloom is that the local ski field, Turoa, with New Zealand's highest chairlift and longest vertical run, was ready for those seeking an adventure. For me, though, it was something different.
The stops along the way are definitely not the most beautiful part of this whole trip. It's definitely the views when we're getting going.
The entire experience while the train was moving brought me back to one of the most significant periods of my life where travel by train was the only option.
My most epic training experience was probably in eastern Ukraine. I used to serve in the US Peace Corps, and I lived way out east in Donetsk Oblast, which is pretty much the center of where everything's happening right now in Ukraine. Anyway, I used to have to go to the Peace Corps office from my city, and it took about 16 hours on the train, and it was always such an experience because everyone on the train spoke Russian, and the minute they found out you didn't speak Russian, that you were American, they had so many questions. They wanted to sit there and chat. They wanted to share their beer with you or their tea or whatever it was, and it just it was such an experience having to navigate that for the first time in another language, in another country where it was a completely different alphabet. It was such an experience.
I thought back on this adventure and many others, including my time crossing the Gulf of Bothnia on a ship, taking a four-wheel drive out to Cabo Polonio in Uruguay, staying with a group in Rubianami and jumping into the snow butt naked. These memories were some of my favorite, and they all took place in the winter months. Why did I stop these types of adventures? I thought. Okay, so the train just started creaking, and apparently we're going up the Ruapehu spiral, which, so there's a 139-meter climb. It was a 7% grade, and it was too steep for the train to go up, and it just couldn't make it. So they basically made this whole spiraling system, which reduced the grade down to, I think it's 2%, they said. But at least now the train can make it up, so there you go. The construction of the Ruapehu spiral is one of the many examples of Kiwi ingenuity, or what they call locally, the number 8 wire mentality. You see, being in the middle of nowhere with limited access to the rest of the world for a very long time, Kiwis adapted by using the number 8 wire, a 4mm gauge wire, to solve many problems. Kind of like duct tape in the US. So the number 8 wire mentality has come to represent a can-do attitude, or the ability to be resourceful in the face of limited materials. However, an announcement of an approaching town reminded me that New Zealand still gets 60% of its energy from fossil fuels, and I wondered to myself if I wanted to contribute to that by recommending this train ride to you. So we just passed through Huntly, which has New Zealand's largest power plant. It's been running for 40 years and it's coal-fired, and apparently a lot of the coal that they get there to power the plant comes from Indonesia. If you watch my last episode on mining, I talked a little bit about that. But yeah, big part of the culture there, power plant. Going through Huntly was a reminder that I had hopped on a train for no other purpose than to go on an adventure. And my instant thought was, maybe that's why I'm suddenly feeling uneasy. I mean, I had spent over a decade in the humanitarian response and activism world. I had acclimatized to a constant analysis of how my actions impact the world, relentlessly considering what I eat, what I wear, and how I interact with people. Recommending a train for the sake of it was certainly not in line with my values. But there was something else. So, like a lot of things in my life, I stopped riding trains for fun. I pretty much only rode the light rail within cities and stuff like that, but I never did trips like this. And I was trying to think why that happened, and I think it comes down to one thing, which is finances. For a very long time, I was in a culture and in a home where basically all financial choices had to be practical and thought through, and spending was minimized to the T, really. And I just remember one time, for example, where I was trying to buy a bike pump for my bike. I used to ride my bike to work every single day, and I researched for days to make sure I got the right bike pump, and just overthought the purchase and almost didn't get it. And it was always like that, where every single purchase was and every single penny was maximized to the T, except for beer. For some reason, in my head, beer was allowed to be justified all the time, which, by the way, I am still quitting. For anyone who's been following that journey online, I am on this trip and I'm not drinking, which is amazing because there's a ton of wine being offered, and it's actually wine towards along the way. So, 3.5 weeks sober now. Woohoo! I'm sure many of you can identify with spending choices being focused on practicality. Parts of my childhood were blanketed with scarcity, and this is a mindset which made sense. But I'll never forget a story my grandfather always told me about being mistreated at his job and sticking with it much longer than he should have. He always ended the story with, "Life's too short." Life's too short to miss adventures because they're not practical. Life's too short to always be thinking of a future you might not have. Life's too short not to hop on a train just for the pure fun of it. And in the end, choosing life for ourselves means sustaining energy to serve others. That was so much fun. So one of the things I basically learned is that sometimes you have to do things just for fun. I'm privileged enough to have the money to afford something like this, but sometimes you just gotta be a little bit more impractical and do things for joy. And honestly, this was so freaking awesome. I'm so glad I did it. So today marks 7 years that I have lived in New Zealand as a permanent resident here, and I thought it would be interesting, since some of you are interested in moving to New Zealand, to tell you what my experience as an expat here, what it's been like.